Genesis 10 is rarely anyone's favorite chapter in the Bible. It reads like a tax audit, a dry, repetitive inventory of 70 names, a spreadsheet preserved on vellum. Most readers scan past it, eager to get to the next big cinematic moment, like the dramatic collapse of the Tower of Babel. But here's the thing. If you strip away centuries of Sunday school framing, you aren't looking at a religious genealogy anymore. You're looking at the oldest geopolitical map in the Western canon. And to understand what this document is actually doing, you have to look at the world it claims to describe. Imagine the post-flood environment not as a mythic set piece, but as a physical reality. The land was saturated, totally soaked through. The great rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, they had all shifted their courses. In the immediate aftermath of a global geological event, the geography would have been completely scrambled, almost unrecognizable. The air would have been heavy with the scent of wet, fresh silt, and the horizon would look entirely foreign to any survivors. When these people began moving out from that Ararat basin, they weren't walking into a pre-existing world. They were walking into a vacuum. The vegetation, the soil, the water tables, everything had been reset. This wasn't just a simple migration. It was a total, massive recolonization of a blank Earth. And in the middle of this, the text centers on three figures: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Think of them as the primary demographic nodes for the ancient world. They aren't just family members. They are essentially shorthand for the three major power blocks of that time. But before we trace those movements, we have to dismantle the most pervasive, ugly piece of historical malpractice in religious history, the so-called Curse of Ham. For centuries, European and American theologians invoked this specific passage as a divine mandate for the enslavement of African people. It was a narrative hack, a way to justify profit-driven, brutal chattel slavery by pretending it had some cosmic, holy approval. But look at the text. It doesn't matter what a 17th century preacher said, it matters what the Hebrew actually says. The curse is explicitly directed at Canaan, who is Ham's son, not Ham himself. In the internal politics of the story, this is a local, land-based dispute about territory in the Levant, modern-day Israel and Palestine. It was a prediction of conquest for that specific region. It had nothing to do with Africa, nothing to do with skin color, and everything to do with the brutal, petty border politics of the ancient Near East. Once you remove that layer of colonial propaganda, the passage loses its curse status and returns to its true form, a census. The text proceeds to categorize the lineage of Ham into three distinct entities: Cush, Mizraim, and Phut. Now, these are not vague, mythical archetypes. They are economic identifiers. Take Cush. In the Hebrew Bible, Cush refers to the civilizations south of Egypt, specifically the lands beyond the first cataract of the Nile. We are talking about the region of modern-day Sudan. To an ancient reader, Cush wasn't a distant, foggy land of mystery, it was the kingdom of Kerma. Archaeological excavations have revealed that these people were far from nomadic. They had organized, complex metalwork, highly distinct ceramic production, and a centralized, powerful military. They were a regional powerhouse that controlled the gold trade, occupying a territory that would be roughly the size of a modern medium-sized European nation. And the sheer level of trade detail we find there? It's staggering. These people weren't living on the fringes. They were the backbone of the southern economy. Then there is Mizraim. If you know the Hebrew language, you'll catch a very specific grammatical tell. The word ends in an aim suffix, which is the dual form. In Hebrew, you use this when you are talking about something that naturally comes in a pair, like your eyes or your hands. And how did the ancient world identify Egypt? They called it the two lands, the union of Upper and Lower Egypt. By using the word Mizraim, the author is doing something precise. They are tagging Egypt as a dual-state political entity. It's an expert acknowledgement of Egypt's unique, twofold geography. Finally, we have Phut. Historians have consistently aligned this term with the North African coast, specifically Libya. Now, we think of it as desert today, but in the ancient world, this was the critical, bustling trade network connecting the Mediterranean to the interior of the continent. The copper, the gold, the textiles passing through these North African ports, these were the raw resources that fueled the rise of the entire Near East. When you map these three together, Cush to the south, Mizraim in the center, and Phut to the west, you are looking at an anchor for the entire African continent. The Genesis author was documenting the economic reality of the world they lived in. This wasn't a theological manifesto on race. It was a status report on who controlled the trade routes. And here is the part that usually surprises people. The relationship between the Levant and Africa was not one of isolation. It was a tight, symbiotic system. The Levant, that narrow coastal strip including modern-day Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine, was the bridge between the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, and Africa. This corridor was essentially the choke point of ancient trade. Egypt, identified as Mizraim, was not just a neighbor, it was the grain silo of the ancient world. During drought cycles in the Near East, trade with Egypt was not an option, it was a survival mechanism. This is why the Table of Nations matters. It tracks the movement of people who held the keys to those essential resources. The inclusion of these African entities confirms that the biblical authors viewed them as foundational pillars of the known world, not as outliers or remote, disconnected populations. Their presence in the genealogy is an admission that without the African trade axis, the rise of the surrounding civilizations would have been physically impossible. We have a habit of reading ancient texts as if they exist in a vacuum, completely detached from the dirt, the trade routes, and the messy political alliances of history. But when you re-examine this list, you see the fingerprints of reality. You see a culture trying to organize its world by tracking the movement of people and the control of resources. Cush, Mizraim, and Phut are the markers of a world that was already humming with activity, industry, and empire. We can keep using these verses as a cudgel for political or racial conflict, but honestly, that says more about us than it does about the text. If we stop using the document as a mirror for our own biases and start reading it as a record of its own time, a different history emerges. One where the origin stories of the African continent are not sidelined, but are written into the very beginning of the post-flood map. The question is no longer what the curse means. The question is why we spent centuries ignoring the actual documented history of these civilizations, just so we could argue over the footnotes. There are exactly 3 verses in the book of Genesis, chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, that function as, well, perhaps the most destructive, blood-soaked lines in the history of theological interpretation. It starts with a domestic crisis. A man, Noah, is drunk, naked, and passed out in his tent. His son, Ham, stumbles upon him. Depending on which translation you read, he either mocks his father or simply seen something he shouldn't. But when Noah wakes up, his reaction is violent. He erupts, not in a calm judgment, but in a rage that will echo for 4,000 years. For centuries, this incident was cited as the ironclad divine mandate for the brutal, systemic enslavement of millions of human beings. And you have to ask yourself, how does a tiny, ancient, and honestly pretty bizarre family dispute in a tent get warped into a justification for global human bondage? Here's the reality. When you look at the original Hebrew, the curse doesn't even land on the person everyone thinks it does. It is a masterclass in historical gaslighting, a mechanism designed to turn a text into a weapon. Let's disassemble the machinery behind this lie. The 17th century archives, they tell a story not of theological discovery, but of economic necessity. Europe's colonial ambitions were, frankly, screaming for expansion. They needed sugar, cotton, and tobacco, and they needed a labor force that could be treated as a resource rather than as human beings. The archives of that era are filled with the frantic, calculated effort to sanitize the brutality of the slave trade. They didn't just need a profit model, they needed a moral architecture. They turned to the Bible, sifting through the layers of the text until they found a hook. And there it was, that singular, strange encounter in a tent. They didn't just read the text, they engineered it. They codified an ancient, obscure family squabble into a permanent divine law. This is the first major red flag in the traditional narrative. If you actually sit down and read the Hebrew text of Genesis 9, you will notice something immediate. The label, "the curse of Ham," is factually wrong. Noah wakes from his stupor, realizes what happened, and in his drunken rage, he snaps. But he does not curse Ham. He curses Ham's son, Canaan. The text is precise. The curse is directed toward Canaan, the grandson. Now, if you are a listener looking for historical context, this shift is critical. We have to look at the geopolitical reality of the ancient Near East. This wasn't a global decree. It was a specific, local, land-based conflict about territory in the Levant. The region of Canaan was the heart of the territory that the later Israelites, the authors of these texts, were fighting to conquer and settle. This curse wasn't a biological or racial blueprint. It was a piece of ancient political propaganda. It served to justify the Israelites' eventual territorial expansion, providing a divine rationale for why the Canaanites, the original inhabitants of the land, were destined to be subdued or displaced. It was a tribal boundary dispute, having absolutely nothing to do with the African continent, the Atlantic Ocean, or human skin color. It was simply petty regional politics, a narrative tool used to solidify borders. But the interpretation didn't stay regional. This is where the machinery of the lie really kicks in. Over generations of bad faith scholarship, that curse didn't just stay with the son. It migrated onto the father, and eventually it became a pseudo-theological, racialized label for all African people. The transition from Canaan to Ham was not a mistake. It was an extraction. To understand how this happened, you have to look at the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. This is the genealogy that immediately follows the curse. It attempts to map the descendants of Noah to the known world of the ancient Mediterranean. 17th century colonial scholars, hungry to justify the booming transatlantic trade, weaponized this table. They took the names in the list and arbitrarily assigned them to continents and races. Shem was mapped to the Middle East, Japheth to Europe, and Ham, by total intellectual contortion, was mapped to Africa. Once this taxonomy was forged, it became a self-sustaining loop. They weren't just reading the Bible, they were creating a pseudoscientific, divinely sanctioned hierarchy. They needed a divine stamp of approval, and they found it in this manufactured link between Ham and the African continent. The church provided the theology, the law provided the enforcement, and the market provided the profit. It was a perfect, deadly symbiosis. University halls in Europe and pulpits across the Americas turned into factories of this interpretation. They codified the Hamitic hypothesis, the absurd, racist idea that African civilizations were inherently inferior, and that this curse was the mechanism by which they were destined for servitude. It is a striking, terrifying example of how quickly intellectual frameworks can be perverted to serve the bottom line. I found myself staring at these verses in the library, tracing the history of the interpretation, and I couldn't shake a single thought. This distortion says absolutely nothing about the Bible, but it screams volumes about the people who read it. We love to build mirrors for our own biases and call it scripture. It is a convenient, dangerous kind of blindness. The irony is sharp enough to cut. The very people who held this curse as the cornerstone of their theology, the people who claimed to be the most faithful to the text, were the ones who ignored the text entirely. They treated it like a permanent biological label, a stamp that defined a person's worth for eternity. But if you actually believe in the authority of these scriptures, you have to admit that it wasn't a racial condemnation. It was a localized, limited, temporal event focused on the land of Canaan. Because they needed a justification for an economic machine, they pretended it was divine law. They traded the actual text for a weaponized fiction. And in doing so, they revealed that their faith had very little to do with the truth and everything to do with power. That brings us to the real question. When we talk about interpreting ancient texts, we aren't just talking about a dry academic exercise. We are talking about an active, ongoing audit of the frameworks we build to understand our own existence. For centuries, the curse of Ham wasn't just a misread verse. It was a piece of theological machinery built to sustain an empire built on human bodies. It is a sobering reminder that any text, no matter how sacred, can be weaponized if the interpreter is looking for a mirror instead of a window. As we walk away from this, the question isn't just about what happened in a tent 4,000 years ago. It is about the modern, convenient interpretations we still lean on today. What biases are we still using to justify our own status quo? Are we reading for truth, or are we just reading for comfort? For centuries, the so-called Curse of Ham served as the primary theological engine for systemic subjugation. It was a convenient, fabricated mandate used to justify empires built on the backs of the enslaved. But look, if you strip away that layer of colonial propaganda and look directly at the Hebrew text of Genesis 10, the narrative collapses. It gets replaced by something far more precise. You are not reading a list of the cursed, no. You are scanning the oldest, most sophisticated geopolitical audit in human history. The entities we were taught to marginalize, Cush, Mizraim, and Phut, are listed here not as outcasts, but as the foundational pillars upon which the entire ancient world was built. This is, honestly, the most damaging case of mistaken identity in history. And today, we are going to dismantle how these African kingdoms were the essential architects of the post-flood power structure, and why that reality had to be systematically erased. Consider the world immediately after the flood. It was a geological reboot. The landscape was a raw, scoured blank slate. No borders, no infrastructure, no established supply chains. Imagine the silence of that world. The mud from the receding waters was still slick, the vegetation was non-existent, and the air held the metallic tang of a planet that had been violently rearranged. 3 central families, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, stood at the edge of this vacuum. They were the demographic nodes for the entire post-flood experiment. Every future trade route, every imperial border, and every economic collapse that would define the next 4 millennia began with them surveying an unrecognizable horizon. This was not a random migration. It was the colonization of a new world, mapped by necessity. Now, most readers dismiss Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, as a tedious, sleep-inducing genealogical inventory. It feels like an ancient tax audit. But if you strip away the Sunday school framing, you realize you are reading the CIA World Factbook of the ancient world. The flood wiped the slate clean, but the geography, the river valleys and the coastlines, remained the unchangeable driver of power. Therefore, this is not just a list of bloodlines, it is a ledger of empire, identifying the dominant economic nodes and the critical trade corridors that would control the future. The ancient world operated on a strict, ruthless dependency system. At the center is the Nile Valley. Think of Egypt, Mizraim, not as just another kingdom, but as the physical engine of the Mediterranean economy. To understand this, look at the Levant. It was a land bridge, a narrow, volatile strip of rocky soil roughly 200 miles long. It was a high-risk zone for agriculture, frequently crippled by drought and lacking the scale to support large urban populations. If the Levant was a precarious, rain-fed garden, the Nile Valley was the industrial factory. It was the world's most reliable grain silo. And here's the thing, the biblical narrative makes a massive deal about these food crises because they highlight the fragility of the entire Near Eastern system. Abraham goes to Egypt during a famine. Joseph ends up in Egypt because it is the only place with enough surplus grain to survive a regional collapse. The ancient Near East literally could not function without this specific African axis. The famine didn't create the dependency, it exposed it. And then you have the kingdom of Cush sitting to the south. If Egypt was the grain, Cush was the gold. Archaeological excavations at sites like Kerma prove that Cush was not a peripheral territory. It was a centralized industrial powerhouse. They controlled the flow of precious metals, ivory, and exotic goods from the deep interior of the continent into the Mediterranean system. Without the wealth from the south and the grain from the center, the entire northern trade network would have collapsed. Their placement in the Table of Nations is an audit of power. They were the supply chain managers of antiquity. Which brings us to the third pillar, Phut. We identify this as modern-day Libya. We view it now through the lens of desertification, but in the ancient world, it was a bustling trade network linking the Mediterranean to the African interior. Copper, gold, and textiles flowed through these ports. Phut was the western anchor. When you combine these three, Mizraim, Cush, and Phut, you have the complete strategic skeleton of the African continent. This brings us to the paradox, the etymological gymnastics used to turn the name Ham into a pejorative. In Hebrew, Ham signifies warm or dark, a descriptive term for the sun-drenched sub-Saharan climate of these regions. It is a literal geographical marker. But colonial scholars, faced with the undeniable reality of ancient African power, the grandeur of Egypt, the economic might of Cush, chose to build a fantasy where Ham meant inferiority. They did not just misinterpret the text, they engineered a linguistic trap. They looked at the civilizations that anchored the ancient world, and while standing in the ruins of that greatness, they used the name of their ancestor to build a prison for their descendants. It was a willful, strategic act of forgetting. They were hunting for a moral loophole to validate the Atlantic slave trade. By hijacking the so-called Curse of Ham, a passage that in the original Hebrew does not even mention Ham, and grafting it onto the African continent, they engaged in theological vandalism. The loudest, most violent arguments about biblical authority were almost always coming from the people who were the most terrified of what the original text actually said. If we treat the Table of Nations as an economic ledger, the picture shifts. The Levant was the world's most critical choke point, a bridge between Mesopotamia, Europe, and Africa. But Mizraim, Cush, and Phut were the strategic anchors of this entire system. Without this African axis, the Levant could not exist. This geography explains exactly why these nations were so central to the biblical narrative. It was not random inclusion. It was an accurate record of who held the keys to the ancient world's survival. If we accept that these early chapters of Genesis are not a clumsy attempt at history, but a sophisticated, deliberate geopolitical ledger, then the entire Curse of Ham narrative, that centuries-long machinery of oppression, crumbles. We took a text that places African civilizations at the very foundation of the post-flood world, as essential, strategic pillars of the ancient Near East, and through a combination of greed and intellectual laziness, we turned it into a justification for their subjugation. We are left with a question about how we use the past to build the present. If the original authors of Genesis intended to highlight the importance of Africa and the development of human society, why did we spend centuries doing the exact opposite? If we can rewrite the meaning of a foundational text to suit an economic agenda, what other historical facts are we currently accepting that might be nothing more than convenient, inherited fictions? The real mystery here isn't just about the ancient world. It is about how much of our modern worldview is built on a foundation of sand. We have ignored the ledger, preferring the lie, and in doing so, we have blinded ourselves to the actual structure of the world we inhabit. And the question remains, if they were the architects of the world's earliest survival, why are we still fighting to keep them on the margins of that history?